Hey, friends, thanks for joining me today on Dr. Mike Live. We've got a fantastic show for you today on a subject that is a hot topic in our culture. Do you realize that we are seeing today a clash of worldviews? We are seeing a clash of political ideologies. We're seeing a clash, in my opinion, and I think that is shared by my guest today, Pastor Brad Winship. We are seeing a clash between the biblical worldview and the worldview of the Luciferians. And I'll put it as clearly and as succinctly as I possibly can. As we kick off this show today, though, folks, we want to open up with a video. Jared, we're going to go straight to Prager University because we want to set the bar. We want to set the definition of what it is that we're going to be talking about, and then I'm going to welcome Pastor Brad to the show.
Democratic socialism. It's not the same as socialism because it's democratic, right? Or something, right? People are buying that. People buy that now, right? Apparently. As though adding the word democratic in front of a word changes what it means. Just because we toss something to a vote doesn't change what that something is, nor does it alter whether that something is inherently good or bad. Couple of examples, because I know you'll ask. Hamas was democratically elected as the government in Gaza, despite the fact that the destruction of not only Israel, but the eradication of all Jews is in their official charter. Robert Mugabe, or Bobby Mugabe if you prefer, was democratically elected by a loving majority in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, how's that working out? Venezuela? Well, Hugo Chavez, noted personal favorite and friend of Sean Penn, to whom he constantly pointed as being unfairly characterized as a dictator when in fact he was democratically elected as a socialist. Well, how'd that work out for Venezuela? Well, it's now on the brink of collapse, despite it being one of the most resource-rich nations in the entire world. Basic things like eggs, milk, flour, and toilet paper are either too expensive for the average Venezuelan or simply out of stock. Out of stock, mind you, democratically. I know. Some of you will say, well, that's not fair because really we knew all along it technically was a dictatorship. Okay, that's fair. Let's move on to example number 2. Denmark? Okay, here's the time where you point to an entirely homogeneous population, about 1/60th the size of America's, and you point to that as the blueprint. Okay, let's go there. This is a place where the middle class can't even afford a car because of the 180% new car tax. And the Prime Minister was so fed up with Americans pointing to it as a beacon for socialist success that he felt compelled to clarify, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Sweden? I love Sweden. Okay, great bikini team, and thanks to that country, my armoire now doubles as a bookcase. Speaking of which, the founder of IKEA, let's be honest, the only really cool export from Sweden, aside from a few good hockey players, left Sweden because of the stifling high tax rate. So, Sweden, good place, not bad people, but a successful model for a viable economy in today's global market? Incorrect. The fact is that over time, the greatest enemy of socialism is reality. The reality that human nature will invariably pull certain people toward individualism and success, and others toward laziness and collectivism. The tension between the makers and the takers always leads to socialism's inevitable collapse. But I know that I can give you examples of failed socialist economies until I'm blue in the face, and you won't care. Because at least socialism is inherently more morally altruistic than the evil, greedy, capitalist warmongering seen in the West. Greed? What's more greedy than wanting to take from someone else something that you haven't earned? Unlike capitalism, free enterprise, which can only occur truly through voluntary transaction, socialism can only occur at gunpoint. That's what it comes down to. If you don't pay your taxes, once you get through the IRS and the auditing and the lawyers and the PR stunts, people make you give the government your money, an increasing amount of your money, the more successful you are, or they send in scary men with guns to take you away. Now, so long as the people having their stuff taken away at gunpoint are in the minority, and the majority feels that they'll get to benefit from more said taken stuff, you'll always be able to win that decision through a popular vote and claim the moral high ground through democracy. Putting the word democratic in front of your socialism doesn't make it any inherently more moral nor less violent. Did you get that? American wannabe socialists also. Get a job. Please, like a real job. You'll probably have to shave first. I'm Steven Crowder for Prager University.
Thank you, Jared. Isn't it interesting, folks, that advocates of socialism want to make sure that we believe it is democratic socialism? And there are numerous clips out there of Bernie Sanders making that distinction, as if that makes any difference. Well, I'm pleased to welcome today to the show Pastor Brad Winship. He is the teaching pastor at Harbor Bible Fellowship Church in Lawrence Harbor, New Jersey. He's been teaching the scriptures for over 25 years. He holds a BA and an MA in theology from a conservative Christian university and a master's in business administration. And he currently lives in Middlesex County, and there is his website, God and Country Radio. Now, I know Pastor Brad because his program, God and Country Radio, airs on our radio station here in Lima, Ohio, WTTP FM. You can find that WTTPFM.com on the internet and check out Brad's programs. Well, I've been listening to Pastor Brad in the last couple of weeks. He's talking about socialism, and another show will be coming up this weekend on socialism. So please check those out. Go to God and Country Radio. I think you can download those as MP3s and listen to them at your leisure time. Pastor Brad, welcome to Dr. Mike Live.
Well, Mike, thanks for having me. I appreciate your ministry out there and actually having me on your program. Yeah, we've been doing this a long time.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm up to program number what? I'm looking at my own website here, and it's 361 already.
Wow, that's hard to believe.
I was saying, y'all, this is the third program I'm doing on socialism, and I probably could do another 50. There's a lot to say about this, and it's a big issue today.
It is, and it's really difficult. Pastor Brad, as I was preparing for this show and doing some reading and listening to your teachings and doing some research and pulling some thoughts together, one of the things that struck me initially was this: it's really hard to pinpoint the number one lie of socialism. But let's start with this one. We'll start here because this is the one that's usually trotted out. The rich, those with the wealth, are keeping the little people down. The rich are greedy, they're hoarding, they're exploiters of the poor. And the fact of the matter is, that's simply not true, is it?
Right. Yeah, you're right about the fact that you could probably make a list of 50 arguments for and against. It's very, the devil's very clever, and it's I've always, to boil it down, you really do have to define what socialism is. Because when you talk to a lot of even Christians, they think you're talking about charity.
Yes.
That when you say you're against socialism, the first thing they're going to think of is you're against charity. And that's furthest from the truth, because capitalism and free enterprise is really all about charity. So you have to explain to them that socialism does not equal charity. Socialism means collectivism.
Yes.
It's apparently a way to do charity. They suppose it to be a better way to do charity. And like you say, it's to take from the rich and to give to the poor by saying we need to do everything collectively together. And, there are things we already do collectively together, such as education, and retirement through Social Security. And so people say, well, listen, we build roads together, so why don't we do all education together and give everybody free college education? And why don't we do, cradle to grave entitlement? Let's just do everything together. And there's a number of scriptural violations in doing that. First, that God has only ordained the government to do certain things. God has ordained a number of different institutions. And so whenever the government tries to do what the family is called to do, it's a complete disaster.
Yes.
But the other concept that it just violates biblical property rights.
Yes.
And that is the number one error of socialism.
Yes.
If you get foggy about that and you lose that argument, you will lose the argument, because it's all ground it on what you believe about biblical property rights. It's really all about the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal, whether
Yes.
from the wealthy or other people. And that's really what's really behind this collectivism mindset.
Yeah. Now, Proverbs 13:23, Pastor Brad says this: abundant food is in the fallow ground of the poor, but it is swept away by injustice. Now, I bring that passage of scripture up as a preface to this question. Is this a fair statement, first of all? Poverty and hunger are the results of government theft of resources, particularly the ability of people to take care of themselves. The ability of people to take care of themselves, as I see it, has been systematically destroyed and continues to be destroyed by a government intent on making people, as many people as possible, dependent upon it. Is that a fair statement in your opinion?
Yeah, I would say that socialism is not a war on poverty, it's a war on work.
Yes.
And yeah, economic systems really put people into great poverty. And I in one of my programs, one of my favorite illustrations is that of the sinking cruise ship, where a cruise ship is taken on water because there's a hole in the bottom of the boat. And all the altruistic people are on top trying to bail out the water, and they think they're helping the system when somebody really needs to go down into the bottom of the boat and plug the hole. Well, the hole in many countries is bad economic systems, and we can go in there as missionaries and we can feed the poor and we can, try and bring charity. But the real problem is not that these people can't feed themselves or build their own houses. The real problem is there is no biblical foundation for economic justice. And so we wonder why missionaries go into an area and the people still stay in poverty. It's because of a lack of biblical economics. So I think the first program, I really talked about the importance of this issue, that this is really teaching people all things whatsoever Jesus commanded. This is not a distraction from the gospel. This is really part of teaching biblical ethics, the 10 Commandments, teaching people how to use money. And look how often Jesus spoke about the use of money, to beware of that covetousness. The guy runs up to Jesus and says, tell my brother to split the inheritance with me. Okay? Jesus says, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. And so he was teaching, a biblical ethic. I mean, Karl Marx was all about the abundance of the things you possess.
Yes.
That becomes your standard of identity, who you are. That becomes the big issue in society, economic egalitarianism. And the Bible says, no, that's the wrong way to look at life.
Yeah.
So it is a bad biblical economic model that brings in socialism. People just become, unfamiliar with scripture as, society moves away from the word of God. Look what's happening in society.
Yes.
We turn away from biblical economics.
Yes. And let me give a case in point, Pastor Brad, for our listeners' sake. Africa, the entire continent of Africa. Now, not just the United States, but many nations across the world have poured literally trillions of dollars into the nations of Africa. And they're no better off today than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. They're still living in poverty. They're still living in corruption. They're still experiencing wars and bloodshed and famines and all of these things. And most of those nations, they all share one thing in common, and that one thing is a corrupt socialist government. Isn't that the case?
That's true. I read a statistic recently that there are 43,000 Western missionaries in Africa.
Wow.
And you would think with all of those missionaries, things would get straightened out. Why is there still poverty there? And why in Northern Europe was there such success, businesses, clean streets, nice homes? It wasn't because the water was better up there. It's because they had the work ethic and the biblical work ethic of the Reformation, that was brought out during the Reformation. And what they need down there is the teaching of biblical economics. Yes. And of course, it's up to the people to accept that. But but that's really where the problem lies,
Yes.
in unbelief.
Yes. Yes. Now, socialism as an ideology, as a political theory, also changes people's worldview. It changes the way that they understand their world, because it actually changes. And I've described a worldview this way: it is the glasses by which we see and interpret reality. And so socialism changes the way that people interpret reality through how they filter things and their interpretation of that. Socialism actually works against the fabric of any free and liberty-minded people. And here's why. Jared, video number 2, please.
In the contemporary world, it's taken as a given that capitalism, with its free market and profit motive, is based on selfishness and produces selfishness, while socialism is based on selflessness and produces selflessness. Well, the opposite is true. Whatever its intentions, socialism produces far more selfish individuals and a far more selfish society than a free market economy does. And once this widespread selfishness catches on, it is almost impossible to undo it. Here's an illustration. In 2010, the United States President Barack Obama addressed a large audience of college students. At one point in his speech, he announced that young people will now be able to remain on their parents' health insurance plan until age 26. I don't ever recall hearing a louder, more thunderous, or more sustained applause than I did then. Had the president announced that a cure for cancer had been discovered, it is highly doubtful that the applause would have been as loud or as long. But what were they so happy about? To be told that you can now remain dependent on your parents until age 26 should strike a young person as demeaning, not liberating. Throughout American history, and for that matter, all of Western history, the great goal of young people was to become a mature adult, beginning with being independent of mom and dad. Socialism and the welfare state destroy this aspiration. In various European countries, and now increasingly in the US, it is becoming common for young people to live with their parents well into their 30s and not infrequently beyond. And why not? In the welfare state, taking care of yourself is no longer a virtue. Why? Because the government will take care of you. Therefore, socialism enables, and as a result produces, people whose preoccupations become more and more self-centered. How many benefits will I receive from the government? Will the government pay for my education? Will the government pay for my health care? What is the youngest age at which I can retire? How much paid vacation time can I get? How many days can I call in sick and still get paid? How many weeks of paid paternity or maternity leave am I entitled to? The list gets longer with every election of a liberal or progressive or left-wing party. And then each entitlement becomes a right. But we're not done. There are even more destructive effects of socialism. Entitlements create citizens who lack a character trait that every human should have: gratitude. You cannot be happy if you are not grateful, and you cannot be a good person if you're not grateful. That's why we constantly tell our children, say thank you. But socialism undoes that. After all, why would a person be grateful for receiving an entitlement? Who's going to be grateful for getting what they're entitled to? So instead of thank you, the citizen of the welfare state is taught to say, what more am I entitled to? Yet the left insists that it's capitalism and the free market, not socialism, that produces selfish people. But the truth is that capitalism and the free market produce much less selfish people. Teaching people to work hard and take care of themselves and others, and that they should earn what they receive, produces less selfish, not more selfish people. Capitalism teaches people to work more. Socialism teaches people to demand more. Which attitude do you think will make a better society? I'm Dennis.
Yeah. Well, that said it all, didn't it, Pastor Brad?
I love Dennis Prager. You know, the the interesting thing about Dennis is, okay, so he's Jewish, but he agrees with evangelicals because he follows the law of God.
Yeah.
And you know, he even talked about in his book they came out with is that the difference between him and Alan Dershowitz is when Dershowitz goes to the Bible and he disagrees with it, he thinks that that he's right and the Bible's wrong. But Dennis Prager said that when he goes to the Bible and the Bible disagrees with him, he figures that the Bible's right and he's wrong. So he usually falls on the right side when it comes to matters of biblical economics and law. But you're right, Mike, about it's a different foundation. And I was working on this, and it just it's amazing how you can look at this for years and it finally dawns on you that most people don't realize that social justice, socialism, is on a completely different ethical foundation. It's almost like you got two foundations. One is biblical justice, and the other foundation upon which socialism and social justice is founded is actually egalitarianism and parity. Right and wrong are determined by the equality people have. So, like in biblical justice, right and wrong is determined by, one man, one woman. In this platform of justice, marriage is determined by equality. Mm-hmm. And so you're on a different platform. And so sometimes when you're talking with a socialist, you're talking past each other because you don't realize you're on completely different worldviews, completely different platforms. Yes. Concerning, what's the purpose of life and right down to how we got here in the first place.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of the issue for the church is that we've allowed the world, we've allowed secularism to co-opt all of these biblical moral issues and claim them as their own, and that makes them the arbiter of right and wrong. And now we're playing catch up. The church is trying to scramble, and as you said, we're arguing on a completely different level, and we're just passing each other. We've got to appeal to a common basis, and that is the scriptures. And I want to pick up on a point that you made earlier, Pastor Brad, because this is important for people to understand. Christians, in my view, they have to ignore the clear biblical teaching, the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal. They have to ignore that in order to support socialism, because as you've already seen, and listen, there are a lot of other resources out there. You can check it for yourself. Socialism creates a population that's looking for their right or entitlement. They're entitled to certain things for no other reason than that they simply exist. And so to support socialism as a Christian, to me, is simply wrong-headed, and you are confused about what the Bible has to say about that. Don't we see a lot of Christians today that are throwing their weight behind socialism?
Well, there's always the more left-leaning branch of evangelicalism.
Yes, that's what I was. Yes,
certain colleges, certain churches, it's there, but the majority of evangelicals, I think, are understanding this. They just don't know how to argue it with those who are socialists. So we talk about one of the main issues here is property rights, and the Ten Commandments, the Eighth Commandment. Yeah. There's another text in the New Testament which I really think really lays this out and explains it very well. Matthew chapter 21, in the parable of the vineyard owner and the renters or the workers. And I was just looking at that the other day, and that is a very strong free enterprise capitalistic parable that Jesus gave.
It is.
That here, this guy, he has a vineyard, he buys the vineyard, he builds a tower, he builds the vineyard, then he rents it out. When he goes to collect his profits, what happens? The workers rebel against him. They have a communist revolution. They have a socialist revolution saying, you didn't build that. We should get the profits. We should own this place. So, they beat up the one person coming for the profits, and then he sends his own son, and they kill him, and they say, let's seize the inheritance. That's an amazing thing, because Jesus didn't come along and say, well, you know what, the farm really does belong to those people. Like Karl Marx said, those owners are disenfranchising people from their labors. But Jesus didn't say that. No, this guy owns the farm. He has a property right to that particular farm. But what's amazing about this is that Jesus uses that social, economic, man-to-man relationship as an illustration of something greater. The God-to-man relationship, where God owns everything, and God is an authority, and man is rebelling against God's ownership and God's authority. And the same people who are rebelling against God's authority and God's ownership are going to rebel in a man-to-man relationship against people and their ownership and their authority. And so there is a spiritual link between rebellion toward God and this whole movement toward socialism in the world. It's a breaking down of really the whole concept of God's ownership.
Yes, amen. I also found a passage of scripture, and here it is, Micah 2, verses 1 and 2, says this: woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. So they plot and they scheme even when they lay down to rest, is what that means. When morning comes, they do it. In other words, they put into action the plans that they've been scheming. For it is in their power, or in the power of their hands. They covet fields and then seize them, and houses and take them away. They rob a man and his home, a man and his inheritance. That sounds an awful lot like socialism to me, Pastor Brad.
Well, let me ask you a question. Who do you think is doing the seizing of lands? The big businesses or the ancient Israeli government?
Yeah, great point.
I mean, I looked at that passage, and a lot of people go to that passage and say, oh, those are the greedy businessmen.
Yeah.
But, businesses don't have the right to steal anything from you unless the government gives them that right.
That's right.
Crony capitalism or whatever else.
Yes.
No, it was actually the feudal system going on there, where the government was giving certain power to nobles, monopolizing land, monopolizing resources. And it was big government doing this. It wasn't individual business owners that were seizing land.
Yes. Yeah. And the government, when the government gets to a place where they believe it's their right to coerce people, I think it was the first video we looked at, what's going to happen eventually is you're going to end up in a tyranny, aren't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, even Hayek in his book, The Road to Serfdom, always said that, socialism, collectivism will always lead toward tyranny. When you lose economic freedom, you will always lose political freedom.
Yes.
If you're losing economic freedom, that's the right to the work of your own hands, which is actually your very life.
Yes.
So that when you lose economic freedom, you will lose every other freedom.
Yes.
For sure.
Yeah, for sure. Jared, let's look at video number 3. And this one is Ben Shapiro talking about the difference between capitalism and socialism.
So, today's topic is capitalism and the First Amendment. And unfortunately, capitalism has gotten a really bad rap, particularly among people of our generation. I'm barely still of your generation. Right? So I'm going to hold on to that signifier as long as I possibly can. Too many young Americans don't know anything about capitalism. They don't know why it's good. They think socialism is good. There's a Harvard Institute of Politics poll in spring 2016, and it found that Bernie Sanders, that loon bag, was the only major candidate with a net positive rating among 18 to 29-year-olds. 54% viewed him favorably, compared with just 31% who viewed him unfavorably. And now they're making the argument we should lower the voting age to 16. I can't see how that goes wrong. The same poll showed that only 42% of young Americans supported capitalism, 33% said they supported socialism. as in full-scale socialism, like 1 in 3 young Americans supports full-scale socialism. Fully 50% of all Democratic voters said they favored socialism over capitalism. 1 in 2. That's probably because young people are too young to remember when socialist nations like the USSR actually threatened nuclear destruction, when they murdered tens of millions of people. I mean, there still are some there's still some Soviet-style dictatorships, right? The communist Chinese are still imprisoning millions and billions of people under repressive, harsh rule. North Korea obviously is still a communist paradise where people are shipped off to gulags. But the idea of socialism has become very popular among young people. And the reason that it's become popular among young people is because they've been told that it is moral. Not that it works, not that it's great, but that it's moral. It's fair. And we all like things that are fair. If we're in a room and somebody has more money and somebody has less money, wouldn't it be more fair if we just pooled the money and then we split it up evenly among the participants? Just like the cookies in kindergarten. Except, of course, that's not the way the world works, and that's not actually moral. Because in a free country, wealth and the capacity to gain it is largely contingent on the decisions that you make. It doesn't just fall upon you. Most wealth in the United States is not inherited. Most wealth in the United States is created over the course of lifetimes by people who engage in economic activity and commerce. Capitalism is good because capitalism is freedom. Socialism is bad because socialism is tyranny. Not it's an aspect of tyranny. Socialism itself is tyranny. The statement of socialism is that your labor is owed to the society. The notion of socialism is that you do not own your own freedom. You do not own your own time. You do not own your own labor. You do not own your own work. You do not own the products of your own work. The basic notion of capitalism is you own all of those things, and now you have to engage in free exchange with someone else who does not owe you anything. If you want to thrive, if you want to succeed, you are going to have to make something somebody else wants. People think capitalism is selfishness. No, socialism is selfishness. The notion that I have to somehow supply you the money so you can sit in your basement and paint with watercolors. Socialism, the idea that I'm supposed to fulfill all your dreams by paying you for something I don't want and have no need for. But capitalism is precisely the opposite. We all do stuff in our daily jobs that we don't like. Why? Because there's a group for it who want to consume it. How many people love their daily job every day? I'm lucky. I get to go to a job that I really enjoy every day. But a lot of people don't. And you know why they do it? They do it because they understand that in a free society, they're going to have to produce something that is not entertaining and interesting only to them. If my podcast had 1 listener, I would have to quit podcasting. And if whatever business you go into has no customers, your business will go out of business. As I'm fond of saying, capitalism is forced altruism. It forces you to do something that somebody else wants if you want to live. Socialism is forced altruism in a different way. It's forcing your altruism to me. Right? So capitalism is about I have to be forced to do something good for you in order for me to live. And socialism is about the idea that I have to be forced to do something for you so that you can live. That's not the same thing at all. Capitalism also happens to be the most efficient system for the distribution of wealth in the history of mankind. It is the greatest it is the greatest engine for growth in the history of mankind. It is the single greatest force for the empowerment of individual human beings in the history of mankind. So, why is it unpopular after all this is said? It's unpopular because it's very easy to demagogue capitalism. Any policy that has diffuse costs and concentrated benefits is a popular policy by nature. Right? Any policy that has diffuse costs and concentrated benefits is going to be popular. So subsidies, for example, to farmers in Iowa, those are popular because farmers in Iowa get a big chunk of cash and you only lost 1 cent off your paycheck, so you didn't even see it, you didn't even notice it. Well, socialism is sort of the same idea. If you don't notice the money coming off your paycheck, then you're not going to notice that that one person is getting a bunch of money. So that person benefits, and that person feels good about the benefits they just received, but you don't even notice the money coming off. Except that in a socialist system, you have to take so much money off the top that everybody notices, of course. Now, socialism in and of itself, as I say, is tyrannical. It is evil. Socialism violates at least 3 of the 10 commandments. It puts government before God. It says that theft is fine. Theft is no longer a problem so long as you and your friends vote for it. And of course, petty jealousy is something that is necessary. It's good to be jealous. Workers of the world must unite, not because they're necessarily being grinded down by the boot heel of capitalism, but simply because they are jealous of the achievements of others. So much of America's discussion right now about income inequality is not about the suffering poor. So much of it is about the so-called thriving rich, the 1% at the top. It's about tearing down the people who succeed, not about empowering the people who are failing. If we were really talking about helping the poor, we'd be talking about helping the poor, not income inequality. Income inequality itself does nothing. That discussion does nothing to help the poor. What we have to talk about is ways that we can help people who are poor rise out of current circumstance through better decision making and better opportunity. How about socialism in Europe? You know, so people who are defenders of socialism and say, okay, well, you know, you guys always mention Cuba, you always mention North Korea, you always mention the USSR, you always mention China. But, well, they say China's growing. China's growing because they loosened up their economy, and now it's basically state capitalism. But then they say, well, what about the socialistic countries of Europe? So this is Bernie Sanders' play. And what about Denmark? What about Switzerland? What about Sweden? Those are not socialist countries. Those are capitalist countries with a high tax system. Okay, that's not the same thing. A socialist country is government owns the means of production. It is about heavy regulation of all parts of the economy.
That's good, Jared.
Denmark is actually a better climate.
Well, that laid it out pretty good, I thought, folks. Pastor Brad, what do you say to people who claim that the Bible has nothing to say, first of all, about politics, and secondly, about economic systems? What do you say to people when they make statements like that?
That's you'll hear that quite often.
Yeah.
But first, I want to say about Ben Shapiro. Finally, a person who can talk faster than I can talk. It's a New York thing. If you don't talk fast around here, you'll never get a word in edgewise. But yeah, I think people just don't know their Bibles. You know, it's funny that it's usually people on the left who will say the Bible has nothing to say about abortion. The Bible has nothing to say about gay marriage. The Bible has nothing to say about economic systems. When the Bible has a lot to say about these things, I think it's obfuscating the issue. But what Ben Shapiro is really bringing up is the moral argument. I think on one of the programs, it all kind of gets blurred, but I divided it up into really 3 different arguments. And it's helpful to divide it up into the historic arguments, the pragmatic arguments, and the moral arguments. So that if you're in a discussion with people about this, you can just point out, well, you're making a historic argument or you're making a pragmatic argument. The historic argument is basically, you know, our country was founded on free market capitalism. It was a covenant. I got this great quote here from Thomas Jefferson. He said, "I predict future happiness for America if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of people under the guise of taking care of them."
Wow.
Now, how in the world could he say that all the way back in 1790? Because socialism is not something that started in the 20th century. Our founders were fleeing from Europe to get away from socialism, the feudal system. And so they knew all about this. And you can look at many quotes from our founders, and they wanted nothing to do with collectivism, with government tyranny. They wanted free enterprise. So that's the covenant we have. If you don't like that covenant, you know, go move to Venezuela, go move to Cuba. The other argument is the pragmatic argument, which is communism has failed. Communism, collectivism, by the way, it's the same as socialism. It's failed everywhere it has been tried. Oh, and by the way, when you hear the word fascist, you know what most people think of when you say someone's a fascist? They think you are saying someone is a racist.
Yeah.
But the word fascism actually means, in Italian, the group or the bunch. It is the word for socialism, collectivism. So now we have these people who are anti-fascists, Antifa, and they're protesting. But if they were really protesting fascism, they would be protesting the DNC,
Yes.
or the Democratic Socialists of America, which they're not doing because people don't even understand what fascism is. Well, anyway, we have the fascist state, the communist state. We see the failure of that. There's all sorts of pragmatic arguments, but still, even with that, socialism is like the zombie that just doesn't want to die. There's always a new generation that is deceived by it. And that's where you have to come with the moral argument. That's really the strongest argument, because as Christians, we know that just because history says something, just because Thomas Jefferson said something doesn't mean it's right. And we know that pragmatism doesn't necessarily make something morally right. Just because you can make more money doing something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
Right.
But the moral argument, thou shalt not steal, is really at the heart of the issue. And that's what Ben Shapiro was going after here.
Yes, that's absolutely right. The moral argument is is the most powerful argument to use in this, and the reason is that it's the most powerful, especially in today's context, Pastor Brad, is because this generation of young people, and let me also say this as a side note to this. I think the reason why it seems to be so popular among the millennials or the younger generation is because number one, they haven't been taught history as they've come through our public education system. Our history and the struggle of not just the United States, but other nations around the world against socialism, against communism, against fascism has been whitewashed. And so they don't understand, they've not been taught the ultimate atrocities that result from socialism. When it gets a grip on a people, it chokes the life, the liberty, the freedom right out of that nation. And we can see that all around the world, can't we?
Well, we've got a real example of this in the Old Testament. You mentioned that, does the Bible really mention this? Well, if you look in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the Israelites had been in the land for about 400 years. And then they come to Samuel and they say, we want to have a king like all the other nations. And the reason that they want a king is they say that a king will fight their battles for them. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of interesting, because if you think about it, does a king really fight your battles for you? No, he hires you and you go fight the battles. So even what they were asking was irrational, illogical. But Samuel then turns around and says, well, this is what's going to happen if you get a king. He is going to take your daughters and your men. He's going to turn them into his bakers, his perfumers. He's going to take the best of your fields. And, it's just going to be tyranny. But if you think about what Samuel shared as a rebuke, there's a lot of socialists who say, well, that'd be a great thing, because then the government would give us jobs, and the government would best utilize the fields, and we'd work through the government. So the very thing that Samuel says is going to be bad, I think a lot of socialists would say, no, that'd probably be a good thing. But it was bad. But the problem is really the irresponsibility of it. Because in that text, God tells Samuel, listen, the problem is that they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. Yeah. And so rather than trusting in God and having that personal responsibility and self-reliance, they were moving away from God. And so they have to find another substitute for the God. And the substitute is always government. The government will be your safety net. You'll trust in princes and in governments. And they were saying, we want the government to fight our battles. Well, that's what's really happening today in socialism. It's irresponsibility. I want the government to fight my child rearing battles. I want them to provide daycare for me. I want them to fight my education battles. I want them to pay for my college. I want them to fight my retirement battles. I want them to take care of me in retirement. I want them to take care of my healthcare battles. I want the king to fight my battles for me. But when you have a Christian consensus in society, they don't even think in terms of handing that all over to the government. They cherish their individual relationship with God and their responsibility before God. And it's a spiritual thing where they feel that ability to take the risk and that self-motivation. But you see a real example of an entire country going toward tyranny, the road to serfdom, in 1 Samuel chapter 8.
Yes. Yeah. And we see real world examples of that today, the results of handing over the responsibility for all of those things. We see that today in several nations. The most prominent right now is Venezuela, isn't it? They're on the precipice of collapse. In fact, I think they already have collapsed. The people are scrounging around in landfills for food. There's no food available, and yet government officials have no want for food. They're still living a luxuriant life. Now, why can't people see the dichotomy, Pastor Brad, between that and the people that are suffering right there in front of our eyes, and yet people are still advocating for socialism here in America? It's mind-blowing to me.
Right. And we're living in a time where you have, this example of Venezuela. Just a few years ago, the socialists were saying that this is a great example of how America, now all of a sudden they've saying, oh, well, maybe Venezuela wasn't socialistic, and they try and give excuses for it. But we have that in the news. And we're also living in a time where free enterprise capitalism is booming. You would think that people would be advocating for socialism in a time of great poverty, but they're advocating for it in a time of capitalistic success. And I think it's not rooted in anything else but what we find in 1 Samuel chapter 8, irresponsibility.
Yeah.
Turning to the government to be God.
Yes.
Because when you don't have God, government becomes your God. You have to have something to give you that safety net and that security.
Yes.
And so, and where's this going to lead? I mean, where's the big case or the big example of socialism in the book of the Revelation? Revelation chapter 13, where the Antichrist creates a system where you cannot buy or sell unless you have the mark. And somebody might say, well, what does that have to do with socialism? Well, that is a command and control economy from the top down, where you do not have the right to the labor of your own hands. The Antichrist tells you what you can buy, how much you can buy, when you've had enough. And that really is a form of socialism, collectivism, being described there in Revelation chapter 13. So we already know in Scripture where this is going to go. And this is really one of the reasons why Christians fear totalitarianism and a collectivist totalitarian economy, because we have Revelation chapter 13 in our Bibles, and we know where this ends up.
Yes.
Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. And ever since the Tower of Babel, the reason God says we've got to break this up is because whatever they purpose to do will not be impossible for them.
That's right.
Because they'll control everything. And so, the college dollars will go toward the secular colleges, and they'll be moving the money around where the ungodly want it moved around. And so that's why we always have to have freedom, because freedom will always favor Christians in this world.
Yes. Now let me give you folks that are watching, let me give you a real-time example of the logical outcome of socialism. Here's what it ends up every time. David Heavener and John B. Wells.
In South Africa. No one here is talking about it.
It's a fact, and if people are too squeamish to understand this, well then you'll be helpless when it happens to you.
You tell me something about your wife.
She went to the post office at the wrong time. The next thing she knew, she had a gun to the back of her head. The next thing she knew, she was in the trunk of her own car. Orchestrated by the usual suspects of Soros, Oppenheimer.
And they're orchestrating the movement of World War III.
It's what's planned for this country. It is step by step, inch by inch, exactly according to the playbook.
What does China have to do with this? On our last segment, we talked about how the puppeteers are orchestrating basically our lives. And they're orchestrating the movement of World War III, which John says, and I agree, is going to be a spiritual war. Okay? Now, let's go a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about what the deep state may be doing, and are they or are they not doing in South Africa that eventually will ignite this master fire that's going to take place worldwide. John, what say you, South Africa?
Just this week, they are changing the Constitution. This is the African National Congress,
Okay.
which is nothing but the Communist Party in blackface, okay?
Yeah.
They have changed now the Constitution to allow the government to seize the land. Now, the government already owns 60% of the land. Do you think they're producing any food on it? No.
No.
There are black Africans complaining that they were given the land, but they didn't provide anything else. The cattle have starved to death. The whole place has gone to seed. This is what they do. Now people say, oh, this is all about freeing those poor oppressed black people. Do we think that it might have anything to do with the diamond mines or the gold mines or the ferrochrome or the molybdenum or any of the other strategic minerals?
That's right.
Now, not only have they changed the Constitution, because the farm murders are occurring at a ghastly rate. And David, it's one thing to shoot somebody, it's another thing to stab somebody. I cannot, I will not tell you on your program what is done to the human body, but I will tell you this. To prepare the woman for her agonizing death, they bend her legs backward to where the bottoms of her feet are back here, behind her. It's called splaying.
They bend it backwards? Backwards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Imagine your thigh being bent up against your back to where the bottoms of your feet are now appear over your shoulder.
Right.
That's what they do to the women. And they disembowel them while they're gang raping them. Now that's going to be pretty strong for some, but it's a fact. And if people are too squeamish to understand this, well then you'll be helpless when it happens to you, because what is happening in South Africa, I'm too old to make these things up. I've been around the world too many times, been around the block too many times. There's nothing in it for me to
Nor
make
do
this
you have
stuff
a
up.
reason to, John.
There's no reason to.
There's nothing in it for you.
It's what's planned for this country. It is step by step, inch by inch, exactly according to the playbook. And the second thing I was going to tell you about is that now the Chinese Communist Party is going to establish an education school in Tanzania and will be advising their comrades in the new government.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up. What does China have to do with this? I'm smelling China, and you just answered it.
Well, the Chinese are all over it. They are all over Zimbabwe.
Okay, so the Chinese are all over it, but yet you have what I'm going to call the deep state, the guys, the puppeteers, the guys you mentioned. Are they married together? They in the same bed together?
Absolutely. Wherever there is money, think of what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. If you are in deprivation, if you are deprived of everything, you can become a wealthy oligarch if you sell enough toilet paper.
Wow.
It doesn't matter how you make the money. See, for most people, they think that money is going to be made through some flash job, like you got to be a rock star, or you got to be a pop star, or you got to be a football player, or you got to own some media corporation, or be in the movies, or something like that. No, you can sell enough chocolate, enough toilet tissue, enough toothbrushes. They don't care, and that's what made the Russians expert businessmen. They found out a way to make money off of anything and everything that is commonly used by everybody.
You told me something about your wife, and it's a horrible thing that happened to her in South Africa. Would you?
Folks, here's the point, and there's a lot more. I encourage you to go out to davidheavener.tv. You can watch that and a lot of other very interesting interviews. But here's the point. What's going on in South Africa today with the atrocities, and John touched on it, and that was very frank language. It turned my stomach the first time I heard it. But that is the natural progression of socialism, because socialism, folks, does not care about individual liberty, does not care about individual freedom, really doesn't care about individuals. You become a cog in the machine. You're only worth something to the government when you're a producer. When you're no longer a producer, you're expendable. Now we see that, and that could take a lot of different legs and go in a lot of different directions. But Pastor Brad, I want to bring you back on. We've got just a few minutes left here in our program today. But one of the things that I want to remind people, and I'd like for you to comment on as well, Pastor Brad, is that government, a biblical understanding of government, and we can go to Romans 13, and in fact, maybe I will. Romans 13:4 says that the government as God intended it to be is a minister of God to you for good, And then in Romans 13, verse 6, notice that it says, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Now, in my opinion, Pastor Brad, and then I'll turn it over to you, socialism is an ungodly atheistic and therefore demonically inspired ideology of bondage and slavery. And I think history has proven that. And I think it's time for pastors to be very clear about this to their congregations and tell them, listen, what's going on in our nation today and the popularity and the rise of socialism is demonically inspired. It is aimed at, ultimately, it's aimed at the church. We can talk about freedom and liberty and all of these things, but ultimately the battle is against the Church of Jesus Christ. What say you, Pastor Brad?
Well, absolutely. And we see in the book of the Revelation that Satan takes over government to persecute the church. And you can see that even in the early church, persecution came through government, through bad government. Even go to book of Daniel, you know, that demon who is over Persia, the prince of Persia,
Yes.
was preventing the message from coming to Daniel. So that there's a connection between the influence of demons in this world and world government. And you bring up Romans chapter 13. That's a text that Christians should know backwards and forward.
Yes.
We're living in the 20th century, which is the age of secularism. The concept of a biblical government has been abandoned.
Yes.
Most people don't even realize that
That's right.
throughout the first 1500 years of the church, after the influence of Christianity, governments believed that they need to be under Christ, that they were under the law of Christ, that he was actually the king. But now even some Christians believe that government, well, those are unsaved people, so it can be secular. But no, we still teach and preach the biblical model.
Yes.
That governments need to be good because they're ministers of God, and they need to get their marching orders from the law of God. Economic, social issues need to be decided by the word of God, not by populism or
Yes.
by, some judges on the Supreme Court. And it really does come back down to authority in regard to, these economic systems. But that video that you just showed, I thought was kind of interesting, that it's really about intersectionality, where you notice that what's going on in South Africa is, racial upheaval. But in addition to that, you've got socialism, communism coming in, because they are all built on the wrong foundation of egalitarianism, parity, rather than on human rights and biblical rights. And so on that foundation of parity and egalitarianism, you have identity, racial politics, you have, gay marriage, you have also, economic systems that are built upon this concept of parity being the ultimate value. So anyway, you see that intersectionality, like you're saying, wherever you get socialism, you'll get totalitarianism, and you'll get, all the other things with it.
Yes. Amen. Amen. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to open it up in case there are any questions from those that are in the huddle. I see that Pastor Dale's in here. I don't know if you're sitting there at your computer, Pastor Dale. Do you have anything you'd like to add or say?
No, actually, very interesting. I'm sorry I came a little bit late because we were in different time zones. But, going back to our own system, our own Supreme Court, we have failed to teach civics, and we're seeing the repercussions of it. We've taken the gospel out of the school systems. We're seeing that. We have got, listen, what's happening to Brett Kavanaugh is absolutely horrendous. And what we have done to our Supreme Court, we have elevated our Supreme Court to the highest position in the land. Is no longer the balance of the three branches of government, but even in our founding fathers and in the writings, the Supreme Court was to be given the least of the powers of the three branches of government. Yet we have excelled them to the highest branch.
Yes.
And that right there tells you we got this thing backwards.
Amen. Yep, you're absolutely right. Well, folks, I thank you for joining us today, for watching. I appreciate you sharing this with your circle of friends and those that you communicate with. Pastor Brad, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. Appreciate insights, and it was great.
My pleasure. Invite me back anytime.
Okay, I will take you up on that, Pastor Brad.
Okay.
Hey, remember, renewing our mind is not an option. God bless you. We'll see you next Monday.